Okay, so it looks like the attendee count has kind of started to slow down. So welcome everybody to the Microstructure Exchange. My name is Cameron Pfeiffer. I'm from the University of Oregon. Today we have Chester Spatt with us. Chester has agreed to talk, and it's going to be an excellent talk about the anti-competitive market structure of exchanges. But before we give the floor to Chester, I wanted to make some minor announcements. So first of all, we have a call for papers open for the autumn session. This is a general call for papers. You don't have to be a junior researcher or anything. So please submit your works by June 30th. The call for papers link is on our website in like big red text. There's like a big attention block where you can find the call for papers there to submit your paper. We also have finalized the emerging scholars selection for July and early August, and we're still tidying up some like administrative ends there, but we'll have the actual full schedule published soon on the calendar on our website. And you can see the actual selections on the last newsletter that we sent out. And then finally, a reminder on the Q&A rules. So if you have, Chester will have two pre-selected breaks where I will ask your questions from the Q&A functionality in Zoom. You can type in your question there, and I'll basically pick the most upvoted questions to ask Chester during the pre-selected breaks. And then for the last 15 minutes, from 11:45 to noon, it'll be an open Q&A where you can ask Chester your questions directly. We'll let you raise your hand and you'll be able to talk to him directly. And Chester, did you agree to stay for like 10 minutes
Yes.
after? Okay, so there'll be a little bit of an extended session afterwards where we can kind of keep up the discussion. Okay, so that's all of my points. Everyone, please welcome Chester to the Microstructure Exchange. Chester, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. I want to begin by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to present my paper. My paper is about some of the subtle micro aspects of microstructure, and focused upon how the structure of pricing for various exchange-related services works in the U.S. There obviously was a dramatic change in the structure of trading in the U.S. about 15 years ago with regulation NMS, which moved to really push the competition across exchanges and platforms, and focused on electronic trading. And there's been a lot of and as these markets have evolved, the exchanges have reached out for new and different types of pricing, new and different ways to compete with one another, and new and different ways to be compensated for their services. And there's been extensive debate about some of these. Two of the more important aspects of the debate have concerned access fees and the structure of rebates in trading, and also pricing about market data. And in fact, on the latter front, there was an important court decision even as recently as last Friday. So at a high level, I'll just note that even though you hear that there are many exchanges and certainly even more platforms, in fact, the dominant exchanges are organized into three families: the New York Stock Exchange family, the NASDAQ, and the Chicago Board Options Exchange /BATS. In the products that are offered, there's tremendous amount also of cross subsidization across instruments, cross subsidization across the different products. With respect to pricing of the trading process, one of the things that's striking is that while the exchanges are offering rebates for orders that provide liquidity, one aspect of the rebates that's particularly striking is that these rebates involve basically bigger rebates or quantity discounts in effect to those who provide the largest orders. An analogy for this is in airlines. Airlines they provide discounts to the frequent travelers, and I'll point to that analogy later in my talk. But in a lot of aspects, the structure of rebates bears a lot in common with that. However, the rebate pricing structure is a lot more intricate, involves all kinds of different definitions, and I want to argue that the nature of this intricate design suggests an approach an approach based upon price discrimination rather than cost considerations, and an approach that's also maybe amplifies somewhat the agency problem. Now, in my presentation, I'll also try to highlight in the latter portion of the talk the interaction between pricing tiers data and co-location pricing. Overall, I think that the pricing model being used by the exchange is a clever and very sophisticated model. So the core, some of the core theoretical insights that I think arise as a byproduct of my work is that to the extent that exchange costs depend upon the total number of trades and the messages and the shares executed, but not the distribution across the different relationships, then to the extent that there are discounts being offered to individual customers for providing more of these orders, in effect, that reflects demand discrimination rather than cost. Also, the use of these discounts or pricing tiers enhances the agency conflict, I think, compared to the basic make-take pricing model, which perhaps many of you in market structure are familiar with, the basic structure of fees and rebates. I think the agency problem, and people often have taught, and I and some of my collaborators, in fact, have talked about the agency problem associated with make-take pricing, where the routing of the orders is determined by the broker, and the broker gets payments that are separate from the execution basket, so that can create an agency problem. But I want to argue that the agency problem with the tiering will be amplified. It's also interesting that many of the largest liquidity providers actually, in some cases, actually get negative all-in pricing, even taking into account their data fees. And I think some of this, to some extent, reflects the fact that on the side where they're getting rebates, their routing practices are very different than the side where they're getting fees. And I think that's also illustrative of the agency problem. So some other key points that I also want to emphasize are that the incentive to subsidize trade, there's sort of some indication that the pricing of the trading services, and I think to some degree the role of rebates, or the role of rebates compared to fees, reflects in part the value of data and co-location that's being sold to the various parties. And to some extent then, the exchanges would like to generate relatively more trading on their platform, because that enhances the value of the co-location or connectivity services they provide, and the value of their data. And in fact, the cross-subsidization that emerges potentially can be seen as very different than traditional price discrimination. With traditional price discrimination, you want to charge the large users relatively higher prices relative to cost. And here, in part because there are these other products, the data and the co-location, actually, you may be willing to discount more heavily the larger users, because it increases the value of these other ancillary services. And a final broad point that I want to note is one issue in the debates about some of these issues has been the role of best execution and the best execution responsibilities of brokers. And it's always been striking to me, in part, even when I was chief economist of the SEC, but also both then and subsequently, that the SEC doesn't have a very well-defined approach to what best execution is and what it means. And this has emerged again in the recent debates, because it's not even so clear what data do the various brokers or the buy-side institutions need to buy to ensure that they're meeting their obligation to their customers. And for a long time, I found it puzzling. But I think now as I've reflected on those issues further as a byproduct of this paper, I've now concluded, well, the reason that these rules are a little bit amorphous is it facilitates the ability of the regulator to respond potentially to evolving needs and standards with respect to the evolution of technology in our society. So, so that's kind of a broad overview, I think, of some of the key ideas that will emerge. To provide a little bit more foundation, I'll begin by just briefly talking about the so-called maker-taker or taker-maker models. These are two very different models. For pricing involving fees and rebates. The model that's been around since pre-regulation, even predates regulation NMS, is the maker-taker model. Here, the orders that are providing liquidity, the limit orders, those are the orders that are subsidized. Those orders are given rebates. And you can think of this as an attempt to encourage liquidity provision. That is, the exchanges want to compete for orders that are going to help provide liquidity. On the other side, then, the orders that use the liquidity, those are the takers or the market orders, they're charged fees. After regulation NMS restricted this somewhat, but it also legitimized this, frankly. It legitimized it in the sense that while it was already predating, it was clear that it could continue, subject to a cap on the fees of 0.3 cents per share. An approach that wasn't restricted, however, was the reverse approach, or what's called the taker-maker. That wasn't restricted under NMS, and this flips the direction of everything. Here we subsidize the taker, and we charge fees to the maker. So we flip the direction of who pays the fees and who gets the rebates. So this is an attempt to enhance or encourage the use of market orders, and in fact, it has a long precedent. Even back in the 1990s, this was very similar to the payment for order flow model, in which some intermediaries, the most famous, or now I would say notorious, of whom was Bernie Madoff, in the 1990s were paying for basically for market orders, and in his case paying for uninformed market orders. The taker-maker model you can think of as kind of a descendant of that. Now, at a high level, this all raises the question, so to what extent do these frameworks suggest agency issues, in which case the routing would be distorted, or are they perhaps consistent with neutrality? You know, the way I think of this is, so sometimes I have some sporting season tickets to some of our local teams in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Pittsburgh Penguins. But a lot of times, well, in the past, a lot of times I was on the road. Now it's not so clear whether I'm going to go to the games anyway. But I have tickets to sell. So I try to. So you might sell them maybe through a direct buyer, but you might sell them through the platform. Now, if the platform charged the buyer versus if they charge the seller, does it really make a difference? Well, our standards theories perhaps suggest not. That would be kind of a neutrality idea. Well, it doesn't really matter whether the nominal prices would be different, but at some level it wouldn't matter. On the other hand, if the decisions were being made, if I was handing it off to an agent, and then the amount of money that the agent was getting was impacted, then you could sort of imagine that the routing decisions across the different platforms would in fact be distorted. So that's a contrast between the neutrality result versus agency. And the agency problem arises in the trading context because there's distortion in the routing decision, because there's distinct buckets on the one hand for the execution versus the fees and the rebates. And that's the fact that there's these two different buckets. The better execution goes to the buy-side customer, but the fees and rebates goes to the broker, and the broker is the one making the routing decision. This sort of sets things up for a potential conflict. And in fact, in a very nice paper, Battaglia, Corwin, and Jennings, they document the agency problems and even name names. They identify, in fact, some problematic brokers in the retail space. Now, some of the empirical issues are kind of subtle. More broadly, there's certainly evidence in the form of routing to platforms that offer rebates, and even though perhaps those platforms provide poor or slow execution, but there's two different reasons why they might provide poor or slow execution. One would be equilibrium, that to some extent the rebates would also be money, and money that's available. And if it flowed through the customer, it would just be an equilibrium effect, or it could be because of the agency distortion, which might kind of amplify the issue. Enhanced disclosures certainly on routing practices or execution costs, would be very useful in trying to resolve these problems. Or you could imagine a ban on the fees or banning fees or rebates, or having a side pocket. In fact, the SEC started to go down a route of doing an experiment, of trying to do an experiment on adjusting the fees and the rebates, but that's also been tied up in the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. That is, the SEC unanimously adopted a pilot to study the tightening the fee caps or whether it should ban rebates, and they set it up with a control group and 3 treatment groups. But then the exchanges immediately filed suit, and the SEC itself agreed to partially stay its implementation pending the resolution, which is sort of awaiting a ruling from the Circuit Court of Appeals. In a sense, the vigor that the exchange have fought against this suggests to me that perhaps they reinforce in my mind that there must be some aspect of an agency issue, that if it was truly neutral, there wouldn't be perhaps so much concern about the platform. On the market data front, there's also been important regulatory action. So going back to October 2018, the SEC declared that it would only approve proposed exchange pricing satisfying the Exchange Act, and really pushed on this issue. And the Exchange Act basically says that pricing has to be fair and reasonable, not unduly discriminatory, and promote competition. So that's really about economics. So economics is embodied within the Exchange Act of 1934 with respect to pricing. And the SEC clearly signaled a willingness to take on the issues of proprietary pricing of data and of connectivity. And indeed, there's been a lot of controversy about this, and the broker-dealers and the buy side have been largely on the side of the SEC, and the exchange have fought back vigorously. And in fact, just last Friday, the District of Columbia Circuit Court held that the SEC lacked the authority because it didn't act immediately. It hadn't acted within the 60-day statutory period to suspend the pricing. But in fact, that might be difficult for a variety of reasons. That might be difficult for the SEC to do, and obviously, in the particular case at hand, it didn't do so. So this is an issue that's still out there front and center, and how ultimately the Exchange Act is going to be implemented is still a subject of lots of debate. And finally, let me just note that there are, even though there's many platforms and many exchanges, there's just three exchange families, 3 main exchange families, and there's some others. But the 3 main ones, and the ones who are using this pricing model, are the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, and the BATS-CBOE, and they're each running a number of different exchanges under their name. I mean, there were other exchanges too. The one that's active right now is the IEX. They don't use rebates, and there are some emerging exchanges that we're hoping to get their sea legs in the next year or so. The MEMEX, the Members Exchange, which is organized by some of the big broker dealers, and the Long-Term Exchange, which is kind of emerging from the Silicon Valley. Now you might wonder, well, what's the value of running multiple exchanges? Well, in part, they can use the exchanges. The exchange families can have different business models, so they could have a maker-taker and a taker-maker simultaneously. Clearly, there's going to be some scale economies in operating those businesses. They can have joint staffing, but they also, besides the scale economies, they also can potentially coordinate their pricing decisions within a parent company or family. So at this point, I've kind of gone on quite a bit. At this point, maybe we could take some questions.
Oh, this is a good time. We actually have a couple of good questions. So the first one is from Michael Goldstein, which is about basically the distinction you made between demand-related costs and demand-related discounts and cost-related discounts.
Sure.
And so he basically says, if costs decline in the number of trades, messages, or shares executed in a declining function, so that the average cost of trades decline as the number of trades increases, why shouldn't somebody who doubles the number of shares get more of a reduction to capture the average savings? And so and he also asked, why is this, why isn't that a cost-related discount because they're reducing average costs instead of a demand-related discount?
Yeah, so I think my point is that the costs are, my point is under certain assumptions, costs would be determined at the market level. Um, and so while if a particular broker doubled their, let's say a particular broker went from a million shares or orders to 2 million, what my implicit assumption is that would be no different than if some other firm went from a billion to a billion, 1 million. So it's really a question of whether the costs are at the market level or at the firm level. That's an implicit assumption that I'm making in that assertion.
Okay. We also have a comment from Robert Karakchik. I apologize for butchering that name. Don't large traders get the rebates? So the agency problem only applies to retail traders.
So, you know, I think of the agency I tend to think of the agency, so I'm sympathetic to Bob's point. I think of the agency problem as perhaps most severe with retail, because there isn't a lot of clarity, and there's not pass through. But this is also related to one of the broader points in my paper, that to the extent that there's pricing tiers, and it's unknown, and this I'll come to later, and it's unknown at the time of execution what pricing tier the brokers are going to fall into, there is still a bit of an agency problem, even with respect to the institutions. In fact, in some respects, I think the agency problem with respect to the institutions is maybe maybe in some respects is perhaps even more endemic.
Okay. And then we'll do one last question from Amy Edwards here, which is a very popular question. Regarding platform theory, doesn't the theory say that cross subsidization could be welfare improving in certain circumstances? So why is it neutral here?
Well, I think, okay. So I'll comment briefly later on platform theory, but I guess the two main points that I would highlight are, first, that one distinction here is the agency issues, which I think are not present in the traditional applications of platform theory, and the other is less founded in the economics, but more about the statute, which is that the Exchange Act and the criteria of the Exchange Act potentially plays a special role here, but that's not so much about the economics per se.
Okay,
but that is, I think, an important distinction that hasn't perhaps been emphasized enough. But you know, Amy being the lead person on these issues at the SEC, she certainly would be more knowledgeable about that than I.
Okay, fair enough. So why don't you go ahead and continue? We'll pick up some of the rest of the questions in later sections.
Yeah. So next point I just want to briefly highlight is there's been a big debate broadly about the nature of competition. There's been certainly a lot of tension, and there's different types of competition. There's competition for individual orders versus competition among the platforms. When I joined the SEC, I was really struck by this. I remember thinking, oh, there's only one type of competition. It was the competition that I remembered from before I was at the commission. And it was the competition to be on the other side of my order. It was the competition to give me better pricing. And when I was there, I quickly learned, well, there's another type. That was the competition among the platforms and the competition to innovate. And then I realized over time, oh yeah, it's like in selling your house. Are there do you deal with multiple brokers simultaneously, or do you have one broker and they're just bringing you a lot of customers? And in a way, those are different types of competition, and each can play a role in potentially getting you a better price. In fact, I learned at the commission there was one word I was never supposed to say that I was in favor of, and it was a 4-letter word. It was CLOB. And first, when I was in my early days at the SEC, and I didn't tell this to Amy, but I didn't even know what a CLOB. I didn't even realize what a CLOB was. Obviously, Central Limit Order Book, and I think what this is really about is about the importance of the liquidity externality on the one hand. That's the side for the CLOB. versus the benefits of fragmentation on the other, which has to do with this other type of competition across the platforms. And in a way, we have a little bit the worst of all. We have these affiliate families. I mean, it's not really their fault, but we have these, not anybody's fault, but we have these affiliate families. So the activity is spread out across lots of the exchanges. In fact, even more generally across lots and lots of platforms. So we spread all those things out. But yet, in terms of the exchange space, there's three key players. So we're not really getting the full benefits of the one type of competition, and yet we're diffusing the orders all over the place. So it's kind of a little bit of a weird thing with respect to the nature of competition. So the rebates and fees, I don't want to say a lot about this. I'll just note that under NMS, the rebates are capped at 30 mils or 0.3 of a cent. Baseline rebates tend to be at about 20. Effectively, they average about 25 mils. But in some situations, depending upon both the competitive circumstances and also perhaps the sizing, there are alternatives. And sometimes the rebates are even larger than the 30 mils. And in fact, this is just illustrative of a simple point about cross subsidization. That in some of the cases, the largest rebates can exceed the maximum fee. You know, I put some examples up on my slide. So I used to be, as I characterize on my slide that I'm a former expert on frequent flyer programs. It's a little hard to be an expert right now since since probably like many of you, I haven't traveled for a while. I haven't been on a single, you know, a lot of you who know me know that I might travel a few times a month, but I haven't been on a single flight since March 6th. But anyway, so this builds on my prior expertise. So many airlines, especially these dominant airlines in the US, they have a number of different award levels. A lot of them have had 4 different levels in recent years and 2 main paths to get to each. So at a minimum, each airline has 8 pricing tiers, and they might have additional limited options to buy miles or to buy status. And a lot of that is actually opaque. But in part, the paths involved at the 4 different levels, they involve qualifying dollar spending and either qualifying miles or segments. So in some years, if I travel lots between Pittsburgh and I was visiting MIT for a few years, so to Pittsburgh and Boston, or in either case to New York or to DC, those years that might dominate by segments, and other years if I had a few transatlantic trips, the mileage might dominate. So there are different ways, and this would be true across customers, of course. So there's different paths. Some of them involve dollar spending, some involve miles or segments. Interestingly, the designs are very similar across the airlines. The fact that there's many paths really facilitates price discrimination and surplus extraction. And sometimes what I've noticed, like late in the year, if I'm trying to figure out, am I going to push to make the reward, which there's counterparts in this pricing tier stuff at the end of each month. The brokers sometimes push to try to qualify, at least there's indications of that. The question is which is binding, and that might vary, and that might vary across different circumstances. But it's you can think of this in terms of discrimination. Now, what's interesting, I think, in part, is that there's a large number of pricing tiers. Now, I've not tried to sort through the extent of the pricing tiers, but here I rely on the Royal Bank of Canada, which has been sort of which has been pretty outspoken about these issues of pricing tiers. And basically the point is they identify lots and lots of pricing tiers in the rebate context and in other aspects of the pricing, large numbers. Now, a lot of these pricing tiers involve what I'll call weird features or odd features, or at least some of them do. And it suggests that many might actually be selected by a single participant, or might even be designed for a single participant. But I don't really know, because there's no data that's out there about how many people chose which pricing tiers. Not even who chose which. It's not just that I don't know who wound up on particular pricing tiers, but even how many people, how many firms, I should say, not people, how many broker dealers wound up on particular pricing tiers. Many of the tiers have complex conditions, some of which are very odd. And I think this reinforces, on this point that it's sort of separate from the Michael's particular question earlier, but it is also, I think, does help inform a bit the issue about price discrimination versus cost, because having all these different bases, it's hard to sort of think of a cost-based rationale that would push in that direction. It's also sometimes that the pricing tiers can actually be relatively dense, so they might actually offer relatively continuous rebates in the sense that they might adjust even as discreetly as half a mil between one tier and the next, and they're increasing, of course, with activity. So here's an example, and the examples I use in the slides come from the NASDAQ, and this is kind of a simple example. Basically, the more orders that are, these are executed orders, of course, the more orders that are provided that we're adding to displayed liquidity. If you meet certain hurdles, the bigger the hurdle you meet, the bigger the rebate on that, and this is on a monthly basis. Here's a second example. The second example is a little bit more complicated because you have to satisfy multiple conditions. And when you look at the conditions and you see that there's all kinds of different definitions being used, you start to think, oh, well, why does one, like on a cost basis, why would one's cost be depend upon these combinations of things and all these different combinations of things? And I think, again, this is suggestive of perhaps some sort of discrimination story. That is the intricate structure, but also the fact that there's layered, that these are increasing, the fact that you have to provide more business to get to the higher hurdle, that's consistent with the way this example is laid out. But here it's not necessarily just with respect to one standard, but perhaps hitting several levels at the same time. Okay, so here's the third example. The third example is a little different. The third example, the way I kind of cut at this, is to say, oh, well, what are some of the different ways in which I might get a rebate of 29 mils? And basically, there's a number of different ways, and the point is, there's just trade-offs. And it's a little bit similar to my airline example. I might get there. I might get to a particular tier based upon segments, or I might get there based upon qualifying miles. I could potentially get there either. Now, you might think, oh, from the customer's perspective, isn't that great? Well, yeah, that's taking the schedule as given. The flexibility is great. But the flip side is that's also allowing in the airline case, or here the exchange case, allowing the firm to be more extractive because they can have tougher standards because of the additional flexibility. After all, that's what discrimination is all about. So the tiers themselves are monthly. The tiers are applied actually to the current month, but they're only known at the end of the month. That's a little different than the airline example. In the airline example, I worked last year to qualify for this year. Now, it's not going to help me so much this year. Although it turns out the airlines, by the way, the airlines figured that out. So now they've already, I think all the major airlines have actually extended the status for next year as well. And obviously we'll see how that plays out. But in the trading case, you're working within the month. The broker dealers are working within the month, and then it applies to the current month rather than the next month. So this prevents the broker from immediately rebating back the rebate to his client, or even disclosing it contemporaneously, which in effect would have helped solve the agency problem in a very natural way. So this is sort of part of the sense in which then this structure of the tiering interplays with the agency considerations. So the types of forcing arrangements that would have been very natural otherwise don't necessarily work so well. The clients and the clients, of course, even recognize the inability for there to be this disclosure or to know what the rebate is. So they don't, it's not even like they blame the broker dealers. They kind of know the broker dealers don't know. And this is part of the point, actually, about the mechanism. So the lack of knowledge of the incentive by the buy side prevents it from being neutralized. The exchange's interest is served, I think, by the agency conflict as it maximizes the broker's incentive. Otherwise, there's no ability to price discriminate or serve as an entry barrier. Now, constant tiers would mitigate some of the agency conflict, as then the rebate would be known. But I should also note that in fairness to the exchange, you might wonder, so why are they, so implicitly I'm suggesting that the exchange the funds go to the broker dealer because of the agency issues. Well, the exchanges don't even know who the investors really are. They're really seeing the identity of the broker dealer. So it's sort of very natural for it to be organized in this way. Well, what could be some remedies? Well, so in one thing that is in place is public disclosure of the pricing tiers by the exchanges under the SEC's fair access requirements. So these tiers are disclosed. That is, the structure of the tiers are disclosed, but there's no public disclosure of which pricing tier a particular broker received. And there's no disclosure of the number of brokers on a particular tier. Now, one possible route is enhanced disclosure. And in fact, actually, the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee, actually, in part, I think, based upon my paper and a related statement that I made on a panel, have actually called upon the Commission to enhance the disclosure requirements with respect to the tiering. And I think, actually, maybe more interestingly, three Republican congressmen actually wrote to the SEC, I think motivated also by the paper, and they suggest banning non-constant. They suggested actually banning non-constant rebates, assuming the rebates are retained. And the reason what motivated them is that they're concerned about small brokers. So they're concerned, the issues about barriers and competition and the like. They're not just about exchanges vis-a-vis the smaller exchanges and platforms, but it's also about competition in brokerage. The Exchange Act says there should not be an undue burden on competition, and these congressmen are concerned that basically there's undue burden on small brokers. So again, I think this would be a good point for me to pause.
Okay, cool. We have a couple questions. So the first one is from Richard Metcalf. And he asks why it is that you assume that pricing should be based on something other than demand. And two, actually, do you want to respond to the first question first? And then we'll do the second part.
Why should pricing be based other than on something on demand? Because in part, the statutory basis for this would be the Exchange Act, which says that pricing is not supposed to be unduly discriminatory or pose an undue burden on competition. So that's the statutory basis that underlies it. It's a funny kind of it's a heavily regulated industry. It's inherently a heavily regulated, pseudo-monopolistic, and maybe a natural monopoly. In part because of things like the liquidity externality. But another way to view it is, it's not so much, don't think of this as necessarily just criticism. You can also, I think, view what I'm saying as just descriptive, descriptive of the structure of pricing from the point of view of consideration of economic principles.
Okay, so the second question he has is, why is it that you kind of assume here that data in particular is an ancillary product rather than a core one, particularly for the market maker or prop trader for whom the real demand emanates because they can profit from it. The profit margins are increasing with the amount of data that they can process.
So I'm not sure that I'm assuming that. Maybe this is something we ought to hold till the final third of my presentation, because I think the issues are going to come up more front and center. Because I think this part then feeds into that.
Okay,
but I think,
then Richard, that would be a good one to ask.
Fair enough. I think that point is fair enough, but I think, at least in part, perhaps the third part will address, but might be scope for follow-up question then.
Okay. So the next question is from Sunil Wahal. And so he mentions that large institutions negotiate commission structures with brokers on a quarterly or annual basis. And so when they're doing this negotiation, they incorporate the extent to which they expect to receive rebates or pay take fees. And so the commission is thus net of the rebate fee, implying an equilibrium in which there are no agency costs, at least with respect to institutions. If that is the case, then isn't the public policy implication to let exchanges compete on price, such as with rebates?
Well, okay. So I certainly think. So I certainly think that much of that there is a sophisticated buy side that's sort of very familiar with this, and I certainly would expect they would take these considerations into account. Now, whether the structure of how these basically the exchanges can post their fees much more post their fees, of course, much more frequency than that. Now, whether there's a problem along those lines, I don't know. But the exchanges can post their fees. I think they can post new fees every month, basically, and without much notice. And whether that's an issue, I'm not sure. But certain, you know, it is striking to me, in hearing some of the debates about these issues, that the institutional buy side is not so sympathetic to this structure. And I don't know if that's because of just needless complexity, or other aspects as well. Certainly, at a minimum, I think they're not so. Certainly, the sophisticated buy side is very familiar with these issues. There's no question about it. I would agree with Sunil on that.
Okay, and then we'll do kind of the final question here, which is, if the rebate for the maker-taker is a function of the total number of limit orders a broker posted, does this incentivize brokers to slice their order book to be less deep with smaller incremental stairwise order series, which does not effectively grant more liquidity?
So I think I need to think about. I need to think about that question. I mean, it may be right, but I need to think. I think I need to absorb the question better first. So maybe we can talk about that.
Okay, then we can continue with the slides if you're ready.
Okay, great. So what? So, oh boy, I'm not going to be able to deal with that either. All right. So my apologies for the bell in the background. But anyway, why cross subsidize? So over time, more and more of the revenue, of course, of the NYSE and the Nasdaq, for example, comes from selling data and less from trading. And this relates to the question earlier. And I do think a reasonable assumption is that the value of data is proportional to overall trading activity. So subsidizing trading might even be profitable. In a sense, price discrimination can even be a form of cross subsidization. And I've kind of already described that. And I think actually this. So and I think that the next slide actually, I really dealt with in response to Amy's question earlier. So cross subsidization, I think, ordinarily is fine under platform theory, but the two issues in my mind are one with respect to the agency issue, and the other with respect to the Exchange Act. The Exchange Act standard, again, is that the pricing be fair and reasonable, not unduly discriminatory, and not and that it promote competition. And it was, interestingly, about a little over a year ago, IEX did its own cost study. Now, under the assumptions that they made about how to allocate costs, they argued that only about 5%, that the cost that they incurred when they were providing as a seller these data and connectivity type services were only about 5% of the prices that they were paying when they were buying the data from the incumbent exchanges, which is kind of an interesting. Now there's assumptions that are in their study, of course, and there's, and the allocation of costs might be debatable, but I think it does raise kind of an interesting issue then about, what cost means. So data is a product. This came up in one of the questions, of course. Yeah, I think data is a product, and this issue really started to focus in my own mind when I heard Mark Zuckerberg's first congressional testimony a little over 2 years ago, and he flat out asserted that his company's data is not owned by Facebook. He said the company's data is owned by the consumers. Now, I think he had kind of idiosyncratic reasons for wanting to say that. I think in part because he doesn't want to get he wants to limit the regulations with respect to privacy and with respect to kind of how they use their data, how Facebook uses their data. But it's a tricky issue because ultimately, if he doesn't own the data, I mean, or at least, certainly if unless he has some at least ability to use the data, that's where the franchise is. Now, in the trading context, of course, there's basic data. That's basically the quotes in the trades. We think of that as a utility, and that's basically sold through the standard industry processing. And that's not, there's some issues about pricing there, but they're not so contentious. But then the exchanges offer a sophisticated set of proprietary data, such as order book data, for example. And they offer also co-location services. Co-location, and sometimes it's called connectivity. So the exchanges, they have the closest locations for getting orders into their platform. And sometimes the purchasers, and of course, some purchasers of prop data would find the value maybe much greater than others. Those, of course, would be high volume folks and perhaps HFTs. It's interesting how the data is set up, that within particular categories, how the pricing is set up. The data prices are fixed and the co-location pricing is fixed. And what's interesting, I think, about that is that so it doesn't discourage activity. So it's not your traditional price discrimination model, where, so 70 years ago, IBM would charge premium, they would almost give away the computers, and they would charge premium prices for punch cards. Well, this was sort of the old model of razor companies. They would give away the razors and charge a lot for the blades. So here it's not quite that way, and it's not quite that way. I think it's interesting because it's the presence of the multiple products, I think, that makes it different. Now, the presence of the rebate tiering and the marginal incentives actually work in an interesting way, and I think a very clever way. Having incentives on the marginal orders, and remember, the pricing tiers effectively induce greater marginal incentive than the average incentive. That's kind of the goal in part, just like in airlines it does too. And so then that's kind of nice because it's basically from the exchange's perspective, because it's saying there's value in being at the it kind of reinforces then the value of being at the front of the queue. And there's a greater incentive to achieve this, and a greater willingness perhaps to purchase the fast technology and the co-location to be as fast as possible. So it kind of leads to some interesting dynamics. And there's some strong interaction effects that this induces. So I think the overall approach is actually a pretty sophisticated and in a way, I kind of admire the ingenuity in sort of setting up a pricing system this way. You attract activity by relatively fixed fees for the proprietary data and the co-location, reinforced by volume discounts for orders that are adding liquidity. So this facilitates the price discrimination. And of course, that's kind of a useful thing too, because when the brokers are sending you orders, presumably the ones that they're on the fence for sending you are the ones that it's the least valuable for them to send to you. So you want to charge them the least potentially at the margin. And so this price discrimination, I think, and the price discrimination also is reinforced because it's not, the pricing formulas are based upon relative volumes rather than absolute volumes. And so I think for a variety of reasons, it's a very clever design. Interestingly, a couple of the exchanges, I think the NASDAQ and the CBOE in particular, have actually said that their pricing wind up actually with a number of large customers with negative all-in pricing, which is quite striking because it means that the routing must be very different on the rebate side versus on the fee side, because the negative all-in pricing also is taking into account as well the pricing of the co-location and the data. So before I kind of start to conclude, I guess the last points I want to raise are about best execution. So what does all this sort of suggest about best execution? So if proprietary data is required for best execution, then the exchanges would be in a position to charge even higher prices as if it were not, because the exchanges are the ones with that data. After all, if you want to have the best data about the New York Stock Exchange, there's only one place to go, and it's not to go to the NASDAQ. And best execution would reinforce that. But on the other hand, I don't know if that's such a central point, because even from a business perspective, you need to have really good data if you're going to compete, especially for the really important clients. And there's a related point too that emerges in a very nice recent paper by Larry Gloston, that the value of the prop data reinforces the value of the prop data of the other markets, that there's a nice complementarity across markets as well. And so while investors can purchase the data they want, they can only purchase the data they want from the particular exchange. But this pricing has largely in the past not been regulated. And yet it's interesting because, on the other hand, in a way, the SEC regulates the pricing of the trading. But there, it's easy to go. You can buy IBM on any platform you want, basically. So it's sort of interesting what's regulated and what's not regulated. A few years ago, the Treasury's in the end of 2017 Capital Markets Report suggested that the prop data not be required for best execution, that just the SIP should be required. And I think they viewed it at the time as that the purchase of the prop data would be a regulatory cost and a source of market power. The SEC hasn't been explicit about what data is needed, but I think that's kind of an interesting perspective because it allows allows things to adjust based on faster markets and evolving algos and the like. And so I think, since I've actually gone over a few minutes, and since I think I've made most of these points already, I'll put up the slide for a little bit, but maybe go on to take some more questions. That would be great.
Okay, cool. So we're now in the open Q&A section. So we've enabled the raise hand functionality. So if you push the little raise hand button at the bottom, I can click on you and you can unmute yourself and ask Chester questions directly. I don't know if Richard Metcalf is still online. He had a question that I think could still be discussed a little more. Yeah. Okay. While we wait for people to raise their hands. I mean, so while we're waiting for people to raise their hands, I mean, while I was reading this, I don't know if there was, like, do you have a good sense of like the relative costs between pure competition, right, where all these exchanges have just like one pricing tier, they use absolute pricing for rebates, like really obvious tiers, and then like some governmental consolidated limit order book that is like a designated monopoly? Do you have like an opinion as to which one you think would be more welfare improving?
Yeah, well, so this is going to be more of an off the top. I mean, I'm broadly sympathetic to a lot of aspects of our current system, except in some of the micro details. So I think there have been huge benefits to the breaking of the trading monopolies. First, going back about 25 years at the Nasdaq dealer collusion, and then about 15 years ago with the demise of the NYSE specialist. I think those were really huge steps. I think I'm not so concerned about the fragmentation in the markets. I'm sort of sympathetic to the fragmentation, but I think within that system, I think there were ways in which the frictions could be structured that would be better. I think within the context of continuing to permit make take, I'd be favorable perhaps to banning the pricing tiers, or at least to much greater disclosures about them, so that there would be more enhanced understanding of why, at least why we have such intricate kinds of structures.
Okay, thank you. So Michael, you should be able to talk now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Go ahead.
Great. First, a compliment. A few slides ago, when you had the two different kinds of competitions between basically on pricing versus platforms, I thought that was brilliant. I hope more people talk about it. I think that was and I think that was a plan. I seem to recall being around for a while now that was actually a plan by the SEC to increase competition across exchanges for innovation as opposed to just for pricing. But I wanted to talk to you about your comment about pricing, that more data, the marginal value of another price point would be increasingly valuable. And let's think about corporate bonds. In the corporate bond world, if you see a bond trade once a month, then you could see a bond trade once every 2 weeks, so twice as often. I think I'd much rather have an additional price there than something that trades in milliseconds. And so
Sure.
maybe you could just reflect as a theoretist and just in general, whether you think the value of more price data has some kind of like quadratic function or something like that. Is there a point where more data isn't really helpful and a point where just marginally an incremental bit of new data really is helpful?
So this is, you're sort of indirectly like asking about faster and faster data.
Well, you made a comment about the
Yeah.
marginal value of data and that
Yeah.
more was better. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
And
So,
my thinking
oh
was,
yeah. Okay.
you are.
So do I always think that? No, probably not. I was really struck by the example in the fall where the NYSE was putting a couple of antennas up on its data center and was going to offer a product that was going to provide a 2 millionths of a second advantage, and and they were getting ready to, and they wanted to charge for it, of course. And it was interesting how even the high frequency trading firms push back on that, because I think what they kind of recognized was the point that even the high frequency trading firm was recognizing the point that you're getting at, which is that at some point there's limited value, and I think they basically viewed it as rent extraction on their backs, because they would probably, even the HFTs would probably need to buy the data, if only because their competitors would buy the data, and basically that was sort of what was being set up. So with that example in mind, I've kind of probably moved a little bit away from what my traditional view had been, which was perhaps the view that you were describing, that basically more data tends to be better. But overall, I've been an advocate of timely data, and in various contexts, I've been involved in weighing in, for example, against the bond dealer's proposal to have 48-hour dissemination delays there, and more recent for large trades, and more recently, similarly in the swaps market. I do sort of think that overall, I think more data is better, but I also agree with you. To some extent, there are limits, because there are costs.
Okay, our next question is from Amy Edwards. Amy, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes. My question is on market data. Chester, I noticed that you have not sent in a comment letter on the proposal from Valentine's Day. And that proposal would change the structure of the SIP. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that proposal, and what it might do to kind of this model that you set up here with market data and proprietary feeds and the SIP feeds.
Well, I think my takeaway from your unfortunately, I'm not as well informed about that at this moment as I would like to be. But my takeaway from your question is that I should get myself up to speed on what's being proposed and what the implications of my paper would be for that. So I very much appreciate the question. And I've not, as you know, on various regulatory fronts over the last few years, I've not been shy about weighing in. Sometimes in the direction of the way the commission is thinking, but sometimes in ways counter to the orthodoxy of the commission. So,
and always useful.
Well, I appreciate that, but I also appreciate your flagging the issue.
Okay, so we're just about at the top of the hour. So Chester's going to stay on for about 10 minutes more, 10 or 15 minutes more, or until we run out of questions. But thank you guys for joining us. So we'll kind of do like a formal close for now, and then we'll continue afterwards.
Maybe I can just thank everybody for both for listening to me and also for asking such interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chester. for your very thoughtful paper and good presentation. And just as a reminder, we have Eric Budish next week, so that'll be excellent. So thank you everyone for coming out to the Microstructure Exchange, and have a good day. Okay, so if anyone has any further questions, this would be a good time to kind of ask them informally. Oh, we have one from Pete Kyle.
Oh.
Okay, Pete, you should be able to unmute yourself there. Looks like you're still muted there, Pete.
Okay.
Okay, we'll come back to you.
There, I heard him.
You hear me?
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. I've noticed in TAC data that the data they make available for the opening and closing quotes is getting sparser. Is that the exchanges asserting intellectual property rights over data that used to be in the public domain, and trying to take it out of TAC and then sell it as a proprietary product that would allow them to make more revenue from it?
I simply don't know the answer to that. I simply don't know the answer to that. I mean, the thing about the open, of course, I'm sure you're about the open and the close. I'm sure you're familiar with, is that's the the open and close itself is, at least in the past, has been just done by the listing platform. But I don't know if that's really, but I don't think that's quite what you're asking. I think you're asking about the other
I'm talking
platform.
about the quotes. So what happens is,
Yeah.
I guess the listing
Yeah.
platforms do an opening cross and closing
Right.
cross, and they publish the quantities and prices of the open and closing crosses on TAC.
Yeah.
But then there's the question of like the closing quotes at the end of the day. Those seem to be disappearing from TAC.
So I didn't.
Not the closing cross, but the closing quotes.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering
Okay.
if the exchanges are trying to turn that into a product that would be used for, I don't know, mutual fund pricing and other kind of pricing where they need maybe a quote as of a particular time, as opposed to a trade that might have occurred some time ago.
So I actually was not familiar with that happening. It maybe there's somebody, there were obviously a lot of very informed people on the call, either from the regulatory side, such as Amy, or who have had a lot of industry experience, such as Sunil. I don't know if others would have information or perspective on that. But I unfortunately I just don't know. It could be there's issues about that. I mean, I think it is true more broadly. The exchanges have been very interested in preserving and enhancing the value of their data. But whether this is manifesting itself in the TAC per se, I don't know. I had always thought of the TAC as more like an extension of the SIP. But so, sorry, I can't be more responsive.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Next we have Eric Budish.
Hi, thanks. And Chester, first of all, it's really nice to see you. It's a strange moment. I had two questions about the price discrimination argument that you've made that have been puzzling to me, and I'd just be curious to say
Sure.
what's been puzzling to me and see what your reflections are.
Sure.
So first on the trading fees, and one's about trading fees and one's about price discrimination on colocation and data fees.
Right.
So on trading fees, my instinct has been very much aligned with yours, that price discrimination, in particular all units price discrimination by analogy to the airlines, seems like the simplest economic framework with which to understand why there's so many, or a useful economic framework with which to understand why there's so many pricing tiers. On the one hand, but on the other hand, what I've been puzzled by on trading fees is just the sense of magnitudes, that if you go through and try to estimate, and I've done so in my work with Robin Lee and John Shem, what's the net trading fee revenue to the major U.S. exchange families? It seems like it's about 1 mil per share per side for regular hours trading. It's higher for the auctions because exchanges have proprietary, have market power over their own auctions. but a mil per share per side adds up to about $200 million of revenue per year. And by contrast, United Airlines is doing similar kinds of all units discount price discrimination, but they have annual revenues that are 2 orders of magnitude larger than that. So that's the question on the trading fees side. On the colo price discrimination side, again, there's all these different tiers of access speed. And there, what I've had trouble understanding is why you need more than 2. It seems like it's valuable to sell fastest access. You can extract some rents from the speed race by selling fastest access. And then it makes sense to sell something slower but more comprehensive than the SIP. And that relates to this big fight over market data reform that Amy alluded to. But I'm genuinely puzzled why you need more than 2 if you're an exchange. So I'm both of those, I'm kind of, I guess, struggling with trying to understand the economics of the price discrimination. And you talked about it in your talk, so I'd be curious your reflections.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll try to reflect. Those are obviously, Eric, those are both very thoughtful questions. So let me try. I'll try to deal with the collocation one first. As I don't think there was really anything, so I don't have a different, I don't necessarily have a different perspective than you on the co-location. I'm not sure what the observed practice is, whether I thought that the exchanges were basically offering really fast access as sort of an alternative, basically. And so in that sense, I thought of it as binary, which is very much in the spirit of what you're saying. So I thought basically the exchanges are out there with a product that provides a really fast access. So in effect, there's naturally two alternatives. So that I think kind of aligns quite closely to what you were saying, maybe completely with what you were saying. On the other front, about the tiering and whether this is significant. So I think here what I would point to, it's not so much a direct answer. I don't really have a direct answer, but what I would point to is the potential interaction between the trading and the other aspects, including the co-location. I think one aspect which is kind of interesting is that and I don't have a sense about the order of magnitude, but to the extent that routing more to a particular platform gets you to a higher tier, so it's giving you then some kind of nice marginal incentives if you're a broker dealer. And in particular, those marginal incentives then interact with the co-location and the data value. But I don't have a way to frame that in terms of orders of magnitude, and it's not obvious to me that it's going to transform the orders of magnitude. But I do think that these things are about marginal incentives. So I don't know if that answers it. I'm not sure if that answers it completely. But I think on the co-location, I think I'm in alignment with what you're saying. And I think on the issue of the trading fees, I think of it as partially as connected as well to the co-location and the data.
All right, thank you.
We have a question from Jim Angel in the Q&A. Jim, if you raise your hand, I can let you ask that question directly. Oh, I unmuted Abigail. You can ignore that, Abigail. Sorry.
Yeah. Hey, Chester, great presentation. And I wanted to follow up on Amy's question. I don't blame you for not being up to speed on a 597-page rule filing. But
unfortunately, I think every one of them is about that. I think that's about the median these days. But anyway, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, but one of the things they call for is so-called competing consolidators. So instead of having a a single monopoly SIP in a particular ticker, basically they would let competition solve all their problems. And I just wonder what you think about the competing consolidator idea.
Well, I'm not quite. Wait. So right now there's one right now it's just the SIP, and that's
Right.
one.
Right. So there's one SIP for tape A and B, and there's another SIP for tape C. And
Right.
their proposal is that you would, instead of doing that, you would basically let multiple people come in. So conceivably, you could have different consolidators in every data center.
So it's kind of, well, it's an interesting issue. It sort of it reminds me a little bit about the issue that the commission was tackling 15 years ago about fragmentation, fragmentation versus relative centralization, and sort of NMS is what emerged. Which I must say at the time I thought was kind of pretty integrative because of all this, NMS of course required a fair amount of integration, but it ultimately I think its effects were in terms of promoting competition. So here I'm not sure a priori, maybe because I need to understand better the empirical facts and the problem that it may be a problem of excess pricing on the SIP. That would be what my instinct might be the issue, but I sort of feel like I need to maybe be better informed about that. It may also feed in. It's kind of an interesting issue too, because it may feed into these proprietary data issues too, because in a way the SIP is also competing with the proprietary data. Now, I have seen a lot of discussion of folks saying, well, we should mandate that the SIP be a little bit faster. Now, I haven't fully appreciated or internalized the full value of that. I think in part because it seems to me that what really matters in a lot of these contexts is relative speed. If the SIP is, so if the SIP is just a little bit faster, is that gonna mean that people aren't going to now want to subscribe to the prop data? And that's not at all obvious to me, because I think a lot of it is about the relative timing. Although some of this, ultimately some of this comes back also to Michael's question earlier, which is, so how valuable is, once we're at some of these kind of levels, how valuable is it to be so much faster? And I don't know that I have anything particularly original to say about that. I mean, I kind of realized that my kind of old style instincts that that everything is about relative time, and and there always was relative time. Well, it is a little harder to make those arguments. I realize it's harder to make those arguments now when the relative times we're talking about are a tenth of a second as being very far away, and a millionth of a second as being close. So sorry, I'm not more informed about this issue. I mean, anyway, I think competition, a priori, I'm thinking competition would be healthy, but it's also interesting to think about how the and faster would be healthy. But does it help that much? And what are the trade-offs? And maybe to some extent the issue is also who's running it. How independent is the SIP from the exchanges, for example, and how are some of those governance issues working? I think that's maybe where some of the key challenge. I think there's been a lot of debate about that and lots of concern about that, and so maybe that's where the proposal also is coming from.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think that wraps up the questions we have. So thanks everyone again for coming out. Thank you, Chester, for coming. I think it was a very good talk.
Well, thanks everybody, and and I see that there's still a number of participants on the line still. So anybody has more questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Don't hesitate to reach out to me on this or any other aspect of these markets. So, all right. Anyway, I appreciate it. I want to thank the organizers again for the opportunity to present.
Well, thank you for coming out, especially. That's a bigger deal for us. Okay, so thanks everyone. Have a wonderful week. Toodles.